Chapter 13 France Nationalism and Socialism. The first meeting of socialist and nationalist in France seems to have occurred in the pages of La Cocarde, in brackets 1894 to 1895, end brackets. Its contributors, who came from all extremes of the political horizon, rejected class war in favor of class integration, without, however, approving a capitalist and bourgeois order they all despised. It was this rejection of bourgeois order and bourgeois democracy that provided the basis of the next significant reconciliation of the 2 points of view, which took place first within the royalist movement of the Action Française, and then between some of its members and the syndicalist followers of Georges Sorel. It is not generally appreciated that the Action Française, which never hid its reactionary views, had been before 1914 extremely interested in questions of social reform and in the possibility of attracting a working-class public it vigorously wooed with posters, with meetings, and with tracts. In quotations, we are nationalistic and consequently social, end quotation, Maurras declared, for his critique of individualism and liberalism had led him to positions very similar to those of socialists who were, like him, concerned with a public good superior to the private, like him, too, aware that a society whose members are left to themselves will tend towards anarchy and the tyranny of the strongest. Where Charles Maurras differed from the socialists was not in matters of social concern, but in matters of social order, denouncing their equalitarian ideas and the belief that authority stems from the mass. To him, authority was clearly established only by the natural hierarchy of competence and birth. This meant that Maurras opposed socialist democracy and socialist internationalism as well. In quotations, there is opposition, contradiction, between equalitarian and international Marxism and the protection of nation and of fatherland, end quotation. We read in his political and critical dictionary. In quotations, but a socialism delivered of democratic and cosmopolitan elements can fit nationalism like a well-made glove fits a beautiful hand, end quotation. The hand-in-glove relationship would be tried and found wanting before the First World War, in the stormy courtship of Maurras and Georges Sorel. About 1907, Sorel had started to ease away from the syndicalist movement, which he found too ready to compromise with bourgeois parties for some immediate gain. Within a few years, the old theoretician had come to agree with the Italian, Benedetto Croce, that, in quotations, socialism is dead, end quotations, and to appreciate the potential public that the radical nationalists of the Action Française could offer. Projects were mooted for a review to be run jointly by nationalists and syndicalists, for which Sorel even drew up the draft of a manifesto. In quotations, this review addresses itself to reasonable men who have been sickened by the humanitarian bilge, by the fashions come to us from abroad, end quotations. But the review fell through, and it was not until 1911 that another National Socialist publication could appear, the Independence, whose steadiest contributor would be Sorel, a patriotic, nationalistic, anti-Semitic Sorel, who compared France's struggle against the Jews to America's struggle against the Yellow Peril, and who flourished surrounded by Maurras's Camelot du Roi. But the more intellectual among the Camelots could not be satisfied with Sorel's rather anarchic criticisms. They wanted to clear up the persistent confusion between liberty and disorder, and they wanted an opportunity for national socialistic studies of economic problems. In answer to their demands, in December 1911, the Cercle Proudhon would hold its first meetings under the presidency of Charles Maurras. Long before Marx, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, in brackets 1809 to 1865, end brackets, had denounced the spoliation of workers by capital and declared that, in quotations, property is theft, end quotations, referring to the great accumulations of property which take or profit from the product of other people's labor without giving them a fair equivalent. But, unlike that of Marx, the revolution Proudhon advocated was meant to establish a society in which class reconciliation, the right of work for all, and each man's right to property and to his own way of life would, as he put it, unite order and anarchy. In the Cahiers du Cercle Proudhon, disciples of Maurras, of Bergson, of Sorel, all agreed that, in quotations, democracy is the greatest error of the past century, end quotations, the enemy of both culture and productivity. Democracy, with its individualistic, liberal chaos, was responsible for the exploitation of labor, as it was responsible for the destructive capitalism they all opposed. Against democracy, against parliamentarism and socialism, against the fat, self-satisfied bourgeois society, then enjoying the tag end of its security, the young men dreamed brave and violent dreams of social and moral reform on an authoritarian basis. The war, which cut short their lives, also cut short their dreams. After the war, a weary public was bent on relaxation, the vested interests on a return to business as usual. Nationalism rode into power with the cohorts of militant conservatism, who looked forward to going back, visualized victory in terms of 14th of July parades extended to Alsace-Lorraine, and squabbled endlessly over issues which had been exhausted long before the war. Valois. But the fascist adventure in Italy revived memories of the Cercle Proudhon, and particularly inspired one of the Cercle survivors, Georges Valois, a dynamic, self-taught economic thinker of great vanity, originality, and talent. He had joined the Action Française in the belief that the royalist movement would help realize his plans for socio-economic reform on corporatist lines. To him, in quotations, nationalism plus socialism equals fascism, end quotations. His ideal was to persuade workers to act together, regardless of traditional labels and divisions which were irrelevant to their true interests. His great success in the middle 20s was the debauching of the communist mayor of Faisceau in central France, whom he persuaded that communist activity could be carried out on the national plane, a point of view which led that gentleman out of communist into fascist ranks before returning him to obscurity and oblivion. Valois himself left the Action Française in 1925 because he sought a more lively activity, both national and socialist, than Maurras's movement could furnish after the war had drained it of its most social-minded members. Instead, with a group of veteran friends, he founded the Faisceau, in brackets, the Fasciccio of fighters and producers by its full title, end brackets, a French version of Mussolini's Fascios, directly and unequivocally inspired by its transalpine forerunners. In quotations, our aim, end quotations, he would declare on November 11, 1925, in quotations, is conquest of the state in order to set up a new political, economic, and social organization, and to bring about the revival of France. We shall achieve this conquest at the very moment when the parliamentary state, powerless to overcome its difficulties, will collapse or disappear. End quotation. Veterans flocked with enthusiasm into the ranks of the new organization. Disgruntled by the financial crisis of the times, disillusioned by a world very difficult for heroes to live in and in which no one asked their advice, dreaming of an orderly, comradely, and pure society, the cream of combat veterans donned the blue shirts of the Faisceau and marched in its parades. Communists came to join them, and also syndicalist leaders like Henri Loredan, who had made his name organizing the powerful textile unions in the north, and very bright young men like Philippe Lamour, who has since become one of France's great economic managers. For a moment, Parliament, banks, and unions felt the touch of fear before the activities of this lively and active opposition. Then Raymond Poincaré re-established the franc, and by 1928, the fascist threat disintegrated before the indifference of a reassured public. Valois himself vegetated through the 30s, moving even further left, connected now with socialist, now with Trotskyite circles, but ever a discipline of the ethical socialism of his first love, Proudhon. The Germans would deport him to Bergen-Belsen, where he would die shortly before British troops liberated the camp. Leagues of the 30s. In 1933, a lesser companion of the defunct Faisceau, much decorated Marcel Déat, founded the Franquistes, whose fascism was more self-consciously National Socialist. Recruited in the popular quarters of Paris, the Franquistes tempted militants away from both the Communist and the Socialist parties. Their numbers remained small. In 1935, they claimed some 30,000 members, But 40 or 50% of them seem to have come either from the unions or the working class parties. Characteristically, in the spring of 1934, we find the party declining an invitation to join a nationalist coalition, denying that Francism could be considered a right-wing movement, and sneering at the idea that there could be anything in common between Franquists and, in quotations, conservatives and reactionaries, end quotations. Dissolved in 1936 by the Popular Front government of Leon Blum, the movement was resurrected by the Germans after 1940. Arrested in the Tyrol, where he had sought to hide after following his German patrons in their rout, Déat would be condemned and shot in 1946. To this brave, unintelligent man, fascism and Francism drew both its elements and its spirit from the left, because, in quotations, being the opposite of Marxism, it is much nearer socialism, understood in the sense of social justice, than it is to bourgeois conservatism, which holds in horror. End quotations. There was no shortage in the middle 30s of leagues and parties, all of which professed that nationalism was social and socialism necessarily national, most of which would have endorsed the words of Jacques Doriot, sometime of the Action Française and later of the Faisceau, who became during the war a member of the National Council of the Resistance and after it a senator of the Fourth Republic. In quotations, "We are anti-capitalist because we are national and anti-Marxist. Our doctrine has its roots in the soil of France. The very term National Socialism can be found in one of our dearest masters, Barré." End quotation. Such movements should not be confused with the 30s' most successful league, the Croix du Feu, Fiery Cross, or later, French Social Party, of Colonel Count de la Rocque. De la Rocque is often mentioned as a fascist leader, but he was no more than an upper-middle-class Poujade. Although as a soldier he distrusted liberalism, his calls for change echoed the hopes of the possessing classes. His views seem to have come from Samuel Smiles, and from Poor Richard's Almanac. End of social insurance and of excessive unemployment relief. End of state interference and the sale of state monopolies to private enterprises. Lower taxes, no more cheap lodgings. In quotations, built without taste and full of suspect elements, fortresses of the Popular Front. End quotations. End of an absurd educational policy that kept too many people from learning the virtues of manual labor at an early age. Colonel de la Rocque was a respectable, law-abiding man, respectful of the established order, at least to the extent of accepting government subsidies for his league. Most of his followers, like himself, were frightened by the Bolshevik menace, exasperated by economic straits and problems they could not begin to understand, anxious about the country's future and their own. But mass meetings and parades are not enough to make fascists, and the Croix de Feu simply do not qualify as anything more than patriotic conservatives. Doriot. Even without them, however, the crop is rich enough. In 1934, when he left the Communist Party, asserting that, in quotations, the great Marxist dream is bankrupt in Russia and elsewhere, end quotations, Jacques Doriot, in brackets 1898 to 1945, end brackets, was one of the leaders of the Communist Party and master of one of its citadels, the industrial city of Saint Denis, near Paris. A veteran Marxist and a communist deputy since 1924. He had early opposed Stalin's domination, insisted unsuccessfully on independence for the French Communist Party, and also, before Moscow came around to it, on the importance of a left-wing alliance of workers, peasants, and middle classes, in quotations, which alone could oppose fascism, end quotations. The prototype of the Popular Front formula, which Moscow launched a year or two later. Censored by his party, Doriot persisted in his heresies, resigned the mayoralty of his city only to be re-elected triumphantly by a working-class electorate, which also returned him to the chamber in spite of the Popular Front landslide of 1936. In quotations, a new formula must be found, end quotations, Doriot declared. In quotations, all countries are not nationalistic, and internationalism is not only an error, but a crime. End quotations. The PPF, in brackets, French Popular Party, end brackets, which he now founded, would, therefore, be, in quotations, both national and social, end quotations. As Drieu La Rochelle, one of the first to join him, would explain, most of the leaders of the PPF had at one time or another felt the attraction of communism. In quotations, for years, Moscow was our great temptation, the temptation of our weakness. Since nothing was being done in France, we dreamed of all the things that were being done over there. End quotations. The fascist fascination could be much the same, and the PPF would act, after 1936, as something of a catch-all for social activists and authoritarians of every imaginable background. Many communists, of course, who had left the party in Doriot's wake, many syndicalists and sometimes socialist intellectuals, but also straightforward fascists, Victor Arrighi and Alfred Fabre-Luce, from the Social National Party that Jean Hennessy, the cognac manufacturer, had founded. Followers of Rocque, dissatisfied with the moderation of the Croix de Feu, many young men who had tried the possibilities of the Action Française, and a host of others, not least questing intellectuals like Drieu La Rochelle, the literary critic Ramon Fernandez, the political scientist Maurice Duverger, and the philosopher and publicist Bertrand du Jovenel. As the latter admitted, most PPF men were inveterate joiners, league-hopping in search of salvation. They evidently thought to have found it in the forceful man who proposed to tear away the disfiguring mask of capitalism, reveal the true face of France, and free it for its civilizing mission among the backward nations. As it turned out, the PPF had to conduct its civilizing mission under Nazi patronage. Until 1940, conditions in France were never critical enough to shift a significant portion of its people into the camp of violent change. The workers, for the most part, were satisfied and, later, cowed. The property-owning classes were not scared enough to go beyond the moderate positions of the Croix de Feu. Under the occupation, however, Doriot became one of the leaders of collaboration, preaching a fascist revolution and an authoritarian regime. In brackets, the masses, which had scorned him as they scorned Mosley, were, in quotations, weak, superficial, changing and unreliable, end quotations, and had to be ignored or dominated by, in quotations, the only great French revolutionary movement, end quotations, his own, end brackets. He would die on a German road, his car machine-gunned by an Allied aircraft, after having followed his masters out of a liberated France. Déat. A very different figure, Marcel Déat had made his way into politics by way of the university, and had made his mark in 1933 at that year's Socialist Congress held in Paris. The speeches which he and his fellow socialist deputies, Adrien Marquet and Barthélemy Montaignon, delivered on that occasion, argued in effect that the reigning plutocracy could be removed only by a revolution that French socialists as such had lost from view, a revolution that was absolutely essential, even if it turned out to be a fascist one. Déat had already outlined these views 2 years before in a perspective book called Socialist Perspectives, 1931, which had been published by none other than Georges Valois. The book insisted on the need for union with other opponents of the capitalist order, rather than purely socialist action on classic and isolated lines. 10 years later, its author, whose pacifism had made him acceptable to the Germans, would found a party destined to carry out the ideas of 1931 and 1933. The Rassemblement National Populaire, in brackets, National Popular Gathering, end brackets, was founded in 1941 and died in 1944. During the first of these years, it was colonized by the gangsters of Eugène Delancle's pre-war terrorist cagoule, revived by German warrant under the promising label of Social Revolutionary Movement, in brackets MSR, end brackets. Once rid of the MSR gang, however, Déat drew his followers chiefly from the ranks of the academic and journalistic left. This RNP, which included many syndicalists, stood for what Déat would call a modern socialism: national, popular and authoritarian, anti-capitalistic but not anti-Semitic, and anti-clerical, not on principle, but only within the limits of immediate need. Like many intellectuals, Déat felt the need to reconcile apparently dissimilar and antagonistic phenomena and give his stand a respectable pedigree. He did this by arguing that the, in quotations, German Revolution, end quotations, of National Socialism was a direct descendant of the ideas of 1789, and especially of the Jacobins of 1793, who had, in quotations, engaged France upon the road of political totalitarianism, of a totalitarian conception of life and of the state, end quotations, only to be defeated by the triumph of liberal capitalism. The argument is more interesting as a symptom than as an explanation, but Déat's movement provides an almost unique instance of a national socialism that drew its inspiration and its cadres from the left, where most of the others drew theirs either from the right or from the sort of authoritarian opportunism we tend to associate with the fascist temperament. Déat's own fate was odd. Fleeing the Allies in 1945, he and his wife sought refuge in an Italian cloister. Hidden by the Catholic authorities, the couple, whom the world thought lost in some alpine glacier, returned to their first profession, teaching, in Turin, where the sometime atheist would die in 1957, reconciled with the Church. Fascist fever. It is easy to understand why Leon Blum should be appalled by the heretical prospects he glimpsed in 1933, in the words of men then still his fellow socialists. He could foresee their logical end in a National Socialist camp which had to be identified with Germany, Hitler, and death. But if they got there in the end, it must have been in good part because the conventional Socialist Party persisted in ignoring that reality of our time which fascists accepted, more than accepted, felt in their bones, the need to do something and feel that something was being done, the will to motion for motion's sake, to action for action's sake, to revolution for revolution's sake. Pierre Lesueur has expressed this sentiment very well in The Story of a Man Condemned to Death, in brackets, Paris, 1950, end brackets, which is the fictionalized life of Robert Brissac. Pierre Lesueur has expressed this sentiment very well in The Story of a Man Condemned to Death, in brackets, Paris, 1950, end brackets, which is the fictionalized life of Robert Brissac, the writer and poet whom execution, in brackets, for collaboration in 1944, end brackets, has turned into one of the literary right's most patented heroes. For Lesueur, as for Brissac, whose Boy Scout enthusiasm at the Nuremberg rallies, in the extreme right press, in the Spanish Holocaust, or in the vaster one that followed, remains the most striking thing about him. Fascism was a great romantic adventure. Not reason, but feeling dragged him along the road of passionate action. Fascism offered the men of the right what communism offered to those of the left. In quotations, the banners of revolution, the exaltation of the clan, the prestige of the leader, of his militias and his standards. End quotations. People took fascism for a policy. For many of those who thought about it, in brackets, for most did not, end brackets, it was much more a question of style, a way of being, of behaving, of reacting to the circumstances of life. For many of the enthusiasts, as for Berslach himself, fascism was never a doctrine, in quotations, but a great access of fever. End quotations. Much the same can be said, not in praise or in excuse, in brackets, for feverish activity ends too often in disaster, end brackets, but as a factual observation of many who adopted the communist religion between the wars. And it may well be that the professional politicians who reinvented National Socialism in the France of the 30s, whether at the Socialist Congress of 1933 or soon thereafter at St. Denis, while they were neither Boy Scouts nor irresponsible journalists driven by the impetus of their polemics, did also feel the touch of the prevailing fever. A Doriot, even a Déat, sensed the need for something, not more coherent, more logical, more theoretically perfect, but on the contrary, more incoherent, more attuned to the moment's complex demands. They sought a sort of revolutionary glamour, of revolutionary promise, that would not rest upon and only upon a body of doctrines cherished only by faithful doctrinaires and irrelevant to the tendencies of the public and the apparent needs of the moment.